I'm joined now with a very special guest, and it's an exclusive. David Kelly was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a familiar position to viewers because it's been held by Rudy Giuliani, James Comey, and Preet Bharara, who also says that he was contacted, he viewed it inappropriately by the president. Thank you for being here, David.
Good to be here.
I will also mention, as I always do, that long ago I worked for you when we practiced law together. But you're here because you understand how these things work. Indeed, some have said that you need an underlying crime to prove that there is obstruction of justice. You prove the opposite in the Martha Stewart case, and you sent her to jail without her being a part of the underlying crime. How does, at a broad level, obstruction as documented potentially by Mueller work, and do you think he has a strong case against Trump if he were a citizen?
So let me put it this way. As a legal matter, do you need to prove the underlying crime that's being obstructed? And the answer is no, not as a legal matter. What I think Bob Mueller did here was very thoughtfully look at all the different factors involved. Constitutional issues concerning what a president has a right to do in his executive branch, et cetera. It's all laid out in his report. I think at the end of the day, he's thinking, putting all that aside, it's not just the normal person I'm going to be indicting. I'm going to indict the president. And if I'm going to do that, I really want to make sure I have a strong case, because there's no going back. I want to make sure this case is a winner. I want to make sure it gets over all the legal hurdles. And I think at the end of the day, that's kind of like a prosecutor's gut. You know, where do I end up with this case? I got the legal stuff down. Can I prove the obstruction? Certainly not exonerating him, but is it something I really ought to charge under these circumstances? And I think that there is too many issues involved there for him ultimately to say, let's go with it. It's a winner case. We're solid on all fronts.
When you read this report, and I've now gone through basically my second reading of it, one thing that comes...
had a really fun weekend.
One thing that comes through, David, is a real emphasis on the analysis of the president's criminal intent. Why do you think Mueller, who ultimately is leaving this for Congress or others to act or not act on, why did he spend so much time, so many pages, basically, whether you want to call it showing the evidence or what some would call proving that Donald Trump was not stumbling around, was not sloppy, but knew better and tried to thwart the probe anyway?
I think you're trying to preempt what the arguments are. You know, I think some of it you heard from the Attorney General saying, you know, he felt like he was under siege. He felt like he was, you know, being attacked. Well, that's not really, it's not a defense, but it's important to preempt all those kinds of arguments by laying out what the facts are that help show what his intent is. And I think it's really important here. If you look at the evidence that he has, it's really, he's turning to people that he trusted, his loyalists, and directing them to do things that even they wouldn't do. I think that's really telling.
Why is that so powerful?
Because because they knew that there's something wrong with what he's asking. And if they, and frankly, you know, look, I think in some people's mind, there's some of those folks who are not of the highest ethical caliber. You know, people have looked at, you know, Corey Lewandowski. I don't know him, but I think by reputation, some people look at him as a political operative that doesn't always have the strongest moral compass.
Well, and to your point, according to Mueller, you're talking about people who would retweet foreign propaganda, would go to meetings giving those offers, would talk openly about whether they could solicit other helpful dissemination of hacked material, although they didn't conspire to hack it, according to this. And you're saying they would do all that, but even they wouldn't go along with let's kneecap the probe.
Exactly. And I think that's really, I mean, I think that's really telling evidence about what his view was of the president's intent. But notwithstanding that, you still at the end of the day have an awful lot of legal issues to get by. And an obstruction case, look, we did it in the Martha Stewart case, but there aren't many obstruction cases out there where you don't have an underlying crime that was being obstructed. The investigation was being obstructed.
Two things, and I'm going to bring in Congresswoman Spear, who's all over this. One is Mueller alludes to, but doesn't exactly say, the other underlying crime might have been other things Donald Trump did that he was worried would be uncovered or would be crimes, apart from 2016 election stuff. Is that a good argument? And what did you think of the fact that there were 12 referrals? Is that normal or is that a lot?
Well, in the first instance, I do think, to your first point, yes. I think it is it could be evidence of other crimes. It's kind of non-specific, but even then, you're going down a path where that thing that's being obstructive becomes more and more amorphous. And I think from a prosecutor's perspective, you really need to nail down what is he trying to. The investigation of what is he trying to obstruct, you know, and it's not good to just kind of throw a bunch of it up on the wall and hope what sticks. You know, I think you need to really focus, have a concrete theory, and nail that down. And I think in this instance, there's probably for him, Bob Mueller, too many hurdles to get by comfortably.
And 12 is a lot or normal?
12 is a lot.
12 is a lot. Have you ever, I mean, you ran SDNY. Have you ever finished a probe and handed off 12 other criminal referrals?
I don't think so. I'd have to think about that. That's a lot of referral. Look, there's a lot out there. So for people who think that people are exonerated here, I don't see any exoneration going on there. And there's still a lot out there that has not yet come to the public's eye with the referrals.
Out of everything you said, 12 is a lot. Sticks with me. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.